In this final project, we worked on refactoring and finishing due date. So what is a due date? A due date is a time-stamped rule that defines what actions are allowed at a specific stage of an assignment. So the due date stores the deadline time, the type of deadline, and the permissions associated with that period. For the admin's view, we can view due dates like this. Each row contains date and time, submission allowed, review allowed, teammate review allowed, meta review allowed, and for the topics, each topics have each due date too. For students can view due date information under current state and stage deadline. During the submission period, students can submit a hyperlink and a file. However, once the due date has passed and students don't have the permissions, students cannot submit either a hyperlink or file. And here is what we developed. We separated the deadline logic into two modules, due date actions and due date permissions, so that each concern is handled in one place and the assignment model does not need to contain deadline logic inside it. Due date actions is the module that assignment includes to use deadlines. This module does not decide permissions itself. It simply selects the correct due date and delegates permission decisions to the permission module. Due date permissions is mixed into the due date module itself. This module determines whether a specific activity is allowed by checking the associated deadline right. By keeping all permission logic in this module, the rules stay consistent and testable. In this work, we also updated the due date model. We introduced two reference tables called deadline type and deadline right. The deadline type defines what kind of deadline it is. For example, submission, review, quiz, or etc. And the deadline right defines whether an activity is permitted at this stage, like okay, late, or no. Let's take a look at our test codes. We implemented test codes in two files. One is for the due date model, and the second one is for the assignment model, because assignment model is using the due date actions mixins. So we will first take a look at the due date spec.rb. So for the preconditions, we made the roles, instructors, assignments, and the deadline type and deadline right model to use. And this test consists of the 5 parts. It's the validation, scope, instance methods, and class methods, and callbacks. So let's take a look at one by one. For the validation section, it just simply validates due date model when it's creation. So for example, this test covers when due date parent is nil, and it expects the due date to be invalid and occurs error. Let's take a look at the next one. When the parent missing, it will be invalid, and when due date at is missing, it will be invalid. And when deadline type ID is missing, it will be invalid. Okay, let's go to the scopes test. So the scopes tests the due date model's property called upcoming and overdue and foreround and for deadline type. So for example, the past due date is the due date which is 2 days ago, and upcoming due date 1 is the due at 2 days from now. And so when we access the upcoming property of due date model, then it will be upcoming due date 1 and upcoming due date 2. The second test is testing the order, because this is the earlier one and second one is the later one. And it must not include the past due date. So let's go to the next. Overdue model. it should contain only the past due date. And for round property, we created another due date that contains round 1 and round 2. And due date is 3 days from now and 4 days from now. When we access due dates for round 1, then it should only include the round 1 due date and not include the round 2 due date. And for deadline type, we are accessing that by the deadline type submission. And if we take a look at that again, the past due dates deadline type is submission type. However, the upcoming due date one's deadline type is review type, and upcoming due date two's deadline type is quiz type. So if we access the deadline type submission, it should only include the past due date. Deadline type non-existent doesn't exist in our deadline type, so it must be empty. And for instance methods, we are testing the overdue, upcoming, set, copy, deadline time name, last deadline, and the comparison operator. So for the overdue, if the due date is in the past, like due date is 1 day ago, then due date that overdue must be true. And when due date is in the future, like due date is 1 day from now, then the due date that overdue must be false. And when the due date is exactly now, then due date that overdue must be false. When due date is in the future, like due date is 1 day from now, then due date that upcoming must be true. And when the due date is in the past, then due date that upcoming should be false. Set is just a setter method. So when the setter method is called, then all the values has to be properly updated. And if we call set method with invalid data, then it should raise error. We store the copied value in the variable called copied. So it should be persisted and it should have equal value to original values. And when we copy to non-existent assignment, then it should raise error. And the deadline time name, it's just returning the deadline time name. So last deadline is determining whether this deadline is the last. So if we create later deadline, then earlier deadline should not be last deadline. That's what the test is talking about. And if one is the only deadline of the parent, then it should be the last deadline. And for the comparison operator, it compares due at. For this example, the earlier one is 2 days from now, and later one is 5 days from now. So the comparer should determine the later one to be bigger than earlier one. So we went through the instance of methods and now to the class methods. Class methods have sort due dates and any future due dates and copy. So the comparison operator determines by due at value. If we create the due dates like this, it should be sorted like this. 3 is 1 day ago, so it should be the smallest value. And date 1 is 5 days from now in the future, so it must be the biggest value. So any future due date means if they have the upcoming due dates. So the due date has the 2 due dates, which is due at 2 days from now and 5 days from now. So both of them are upcoming due dates, so any future due dates should be true. And when the 2 due dates in the list are due at 2 days ago and 5 days ago, it should return false because none of them are upcoming due dates. And when array is empty, there are no upcoming due dates, so it should be false. And if they have one past due date and one future due date, any future due dates should be true. So copy method should create due dates for target assignment and should preserve original assignment due dates. And it should copy all attributes correctly, so all the attributes should be equal to original one. If source assignment doesn't have any due dates, then it should not create any due dates. And when source assignment does not exist, it should raise error. And the same for the target assignment. So the next one is callback. It's the callback called before set default round. So if round is not specified, then it should set round to 1 because the default value is 1. And when the round is explicitly set, then it should not override the value. So the round should be same, 3 and 3. And when round is set to nil explicitly, then it should set the default value, which is 1, before saving. So the next tests are in the assignment spec.rb because assignment model is including the due date actions module. So we are testing due date actions modules under the assignment model. So we have the 5 functions to test. So the activity permissible function returns true for allowed activity, and if no upcoming due date exists, then it should return false. So the assignment is due at 2 days from now, and so we can do the submit activity, so it should be true. And the submission permissible is delegating to activity permissible with the colon submission symbol and should return true. So for the activity permissible for method, it checks whether the activity is permissible in the specific period of time. So when you see where the activity permissible for is called, it takes 2 arguments, the activities type like deadline type and the time period. So for this example, the submission allowed ID is the OK right. So the activity permissible for should be true. And if we update the past due date submission allowed ID to no write.id, then the activity is not permissible. And it should ignore the future deadlines when evaluating permissions. So even though future due date forbids submission, activity permissible for current time period should be true. And you should use a future point in time to select future deadline. It means if we travel to 4 days from now using the travel to library, then it should be false because the 4 days ago applies to this time period and the submission allowed ID is no write.id. So the activity permissible for becomes false. If we travel to 3 days ago minus 1 hour, then no deadline exists for this time period. So the activity permissible for should be false. The next one is next due date. The next due date returns the earliest upcoming due date. So if we have 2 due dates for this assignment, and one is 2 days from now and second one is 5 days from now, then it should return the earliest upcoming due date. And if we don't have the due dates for the assignment, then the next due date should be nil. And the last method, deadlines properly ordered. The submission should be earlier than review. And in this case, submission is 1 day from now and review is 3 days from now, so they are properly ordered, so it should be true. And In this case, submission is later than the review, so this method is returning false.